Now, an ancient man is revealing that the secrets of Egypt, the country where the history is full of mysteries.
In 1902, British archaeologists pried open a sealed clay pot that hadn't been touched in 5,000 years. Inside wasn't gold, wasn't grain. It was a human body. And when scientists finally decoded the DNA locked inside his teeth, they found an answer that contradicts almost everything you were taught about ancient Egypt. The Nile Valley in the early 20th century was the world's most competitive treasure hunt. European archaeologists raced to claim tombs, temples, and the golden relics inside them. Headlines belonged to pharaohs, but not every dig was about glory. In the early 1890s through the early 1900s, British Egyptologist Percy Newbery led a series of expeditions to Beni Hassan, a necropolis carved into the limestone cliffs of Middle Egypt. Newbery's team wasn't chasing treasure. They were mapping burial shafts, documenting tomb paintings, and cataloging the ordinary dead, the people history forgot. During one of these excavation seasons, sometime around the turn of the century, a worker's tool struck something unexpected beneath the sand. Not bedrock, not a coffin. A massive clay vessel, undecorated, utilitarian. Its mouth was sealed shut with dried plaster, deliberately, carefully, finally. They pried it open. Inside was a man, not mummified, not wrapped in linen. He was curled in a fetal position, his skeleton remarkably intact. The sealed vessel had created an accidental vacuum, a microclimate that shielded him from moisture, air, and 5 millennia of decay. Now, pot burials weren't unheard of in ancient Egypt. Infants and children were sometimes interred in large vessels during the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. But an adult, in a jar this size? That was rare. That was deliberate. There were no grave goods, no amulets, no name, no prayer inscribed to guide him through the underworld. Whoever buried this man cared enough to seal him with precision, but not enough, or perhaps not wealthy enough, to give him the full rights of the elite. His remains were shipped back to Britain, accessioned into a university collection, and filed away. A footnote in an excavation report. Middle Egypt, sealed pot burial. Probable Old Kingdom period. And there he sat. For over 100 years. Now here's the thing. Thousands of ancient Egyptian remains have been studied, measured, X-rayed. But almost none of them have yielded usable DNA. Egypt's heat destroys genetic material. Mummification chemicals shred it further. For decades, the idea of reading an ancient Egyptian genome was considered essentially impossible. But this man, he was different, and nobody realized it yet. When modern osteologists, bone specialists, finally re-examined the skeleton, they didn't find a pharaoh. They found something arguably more interesting. A working life, written in calcium and collagen. The vertebrae showed compression consistent with decades of repetitive posture, long hours in a crouched or seated position. The shoulder joints displayed pronounced muscle attachment sites, evidence of sustained rotational movement. The wrists carried microfractures, healed, repeated, the kind you see in hands that absorbed constant impact and vibration. But together, the pattern was distinctive. This man performed heavy, skilled, repetitive manual labor for most of his adult life. He wasn't a farmer, he wasn't a quarryman. The specific combination of spinal compression, shoulder rotation, and wrist stress pointed toward a particular craft. He may have been a potter. Now, let me be precise here. We can't prove that from bones alone. What the skeleton tells us is that his body endured the exact stresses that potting would produce. It's a hypothesis, not a verdict. But it's a compelling one. And here's why it matters. Beyond the poetry of a potter buried in a pot, the conditions that made his life hard are exactly what made his death so scientifically valuable. He wasn't mummified. His organs weren't removed and treated with natron. His body wasn't soaked in resins that destroy DNA at the molecular level. Instead, he was placed fresh into a sealed ceramic environment that essentially freeze-dried his remains from the inside. His teeth, in particular, were pristine. And teeth are fortresses for DNA. The hard enamel shell protects the pulp chamber inside, where genetic material can survive for thousands of years if the conditions are right. The conditions were right. To understand why this genome matters, you need to understand how hard ancient Egyptian DNA has been to get. DNA degrades over time. Heat accelerates that process exponentially. Egypt's desert climate, with surface temperatures that can exceed 70 degrees Celsius, is one of the worst environments on Earth for genetic preservation. On top of that, the chemicals used in traditional mummification, natron salts, tree resins, oils, actively break down nucleic acids. The landmark study came in 2017, when a team led by Johannes Kraus and Verena Schuenemann, published in Nature Communications, successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from 151 mummies found at Abusir el-Melek in Middle Egypt. It was the first reliable, large-scale genetic study of ancient Egyptians. But even then, the oldest usable samples dated to around 1400 BCE, the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, remained genetically dark. The sealed pot burial offered a chance to push further back, way further. If the dating was correct, this man lived between approximately 2600 and 2500 BCE during the Old Kingdom itself, the Age of Khufu, the age when the Great Pyramid was rising at Giza, more than 1,000 years older than the Abusir el-Melek samples. And critically, his preservation pathway was completely different. No chemicals, no reasons, just clay and time. Using the ultra-sterile extraction protocols developed for ancient DNA work, protocols so stringent that a single modern skin cell can ruin an entire sample, researchers carefully accessed one of his molars. They drilled into the root, extracted the degraded genetic material inside, and began the painstaking process of sequencing. Ancient DNA doesn't come out clean. It comes out shattered. Millions of tiny overlapping fragments, contaminated with bacterial DNA, fungal DNA, and the genetic traces of every person who handled the remains over the past century. The real work isn't extraction. It's filtration, separating the signal from the noise. It took months. But the signal emerged, a nearly complete human genome extracted from a man who lived during the Pyramid Age. If confirmed and replicated, and that caveat matters, it would represent the oldest high-quality genome ever recovered from ancient Egypt. For the first time, science had a potential biological blueprint of someone who lived during the founding era of pharaonic civilization. And what that blueprint revealed didn't match the story most of us were told. Let's talk about what the DNA actually showed, and let's be precise, because this is where the story has been oversimplified in the past, and where it gets genuinely fascinating. For most of the 20th century, there were two competing narratives about the origins of Egyptian civilization. One held that Egypt was essentially homegrown, that the people of the Nile Valley independently developed agriculture, writing monumental architecture, and centralized government. The other, often tinged with colonial assumptions, suggested that civilization was brought to Egypt from the Near East or even Europe. Both of these, it turns out, were too simple. And the genetics help explain why. The 2017 Abusir el-Melek study had already delivered a surprise. The ancient Egyptians sampled, dating from the New Kingdom through the Roman period, were genetically closest not to modern sub-Saharan African populations, but to ancient and modern Near Eastern populations, particularly those from the Levant. They clustered with Bronze Age inhabitants of what is now Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. The study also found that modern Egyptians carry significantly more sub-Saharan African genetic ancestry than their ancient predecessors, likely the result of increased trans-Saharan migration and trade routes that expanded over the last 2,000 years. Now, the sealed pot individual, if the analysis holds, pushes this picture back another millennium, into the Old Kingdom itself. His genome appears to show a mixed ancestral profile, a substantial component consistent with ancient North African and Nile Valley populations, what you might call indigenous, but also a major component. The published research on similar era populations suggests it could be in the range of 20 to 30%, though exact figures vary by analytical method, linked to early Neolithic farming populations from the Fertile Crescent. Let me be clear about what this means and what it doesn't. It does not mean that outsiders came and built civilization for the Egyptians. That's a colonial myth, and the genetics don't support it. What it does suggest is something more interesting, that the population of the Nile Valley, even before the pharaohs, was already a product of deep, ancient mixing. People from the Levant and the broader Fertile Crescent, The same populations who pioneered agriculture starting around 10,000 BCE migrated, traded, and intermarried with the indigenous peoples of North Africa and the Nile Valley over thousands of years. By the time the first pyramids rose, the Egyptian population was already a blend. Not through conquest, not through a single migration event, through millennia of slow human connection. Research from institutions including the Max Planck Institute and the Francis Crick Institute has reinforced this picture. Scientists like Johannes Krauss, Pontus Skoglund, and David Reich have emphasized that virtually all ancient populations, not just Egyptians, turn out to be more mixed than anyone expected. As Reich wrote in his landmark book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, the genome revolution has shown that almost no population is pure or unmixed. Mixture is the rule, not the exception. Egypt is not an anomaly. It's the norm. What's extraordinary is that we can now see it at the individual level, in the body of a single craftsman, based on genetic markers. And I want to stress that phenotype prediction from ancient DNA is probabilistic, not definitive. Researchers estimated that this man likely had dark brown skin, brown eyes, and a robust build. He would have looked much like many modern North African and Middle Eastern populations. An ordinary face in an extraordinary time. He never knew the Great Pyramid. Or maybe he did. We can't know what he saw from the cliffs of Beni Hassan, but we know what was inside him. A genetic record of thousands of years of human migration, encoded in every cell of his body. He was, in the most literal sense, a living document of connection. Now, I need to address something directly, because any conversation about ancient Egyptian ancestry inevitably collides with modern debates about race, identity, and who gets to claim ancient Egypt. For decades, these debates have generated more heat than light. Afrocentric scholars have argued, with historical justification, the European Egyptology systematically downplayed or erased the African identity of ancient Egyptians. Meanwhile, others have pushed back, sometimes with their own agendas. The argument has been fierce, often ugly, and usually conducted without any genetic data at all. So what does the DNA actually tell us? It tells us that the question itself, were the ancient Egyptians African or Middle Eastern, is the wrong question. It's based on modern racial categories that didn't exist in the ancient world. The ancient Egyptians were both, and neither. They were a Nile Valley population shaped by thousands of years of interaction between African and Near Eastern gene pools. They don't fit neatly into any modern box, and that's not a failure of the science. It's the point. The genome doesn't belong to any modern political narrative. It belongs to a man who lived and worked and died 5,000 years ago in a world that had no concept of the categories we're trying to force him into. And maybe that's the most important thing the sealed pot tells us. Not just about Egypt, about ourselves, about how desperate we are to draw lines around the past, and how stubbornly the past refuses to stay inside them. Let's step back from the data for a moment, because there is something almost unbearably poetic about this story, and it deserves to be said plainly. A man, we don't know his name, will never know his name, spent his life working with clay. If the skeletal evidence is right, he sat at a wheel, day after day, year after year, shaping wet earth into vessels, pots for grain, pots for water, pots for beer, the essential, unglamorous containers that kept civilization running. When he died, someone placed him inside one of those containers. Not a golden sarcophagus, not a painted tomb, a pot, the material he knew better than anything in the world. And that pot did something miraculous. It kept him intact. It kept his teeth sealed. It kept the DNA inside those teeth viable. For 5,000 years. Through the fall of the Old Kingdom, the rise of Greece and Rome, the Arab conquest, the Ottoman Empire, the colonial era, 2 world wars, and the invention of genetic sequencing, the thing he spent his life making, is the thing that kept his story alive long enough for us to read it. In the end, the sealed pot mystery isn't really about Egypt. It's about what we choose to remember and what we accidentally preserve. The pharaohs built monuments designed to last forever. Most of their DNA is gone. Their mummification destroyed it. Their golden tombs couldn't protect the one thing that mattered most, the biological record of who they actually were. But this man, This anonymous, working-class, clay-stained craftsman survived. Not because anyone planned it, but because the simplest materials, sealed with care, can outlast the grandest ambitions. History doesn't always speak through kings. Sometimes it whispers through potters. Here's what I want to know from you. This man's genome suggests that ancient Egypt was a crossroads, a place shaped by migration and mixing long before the first pharaoh. But this is one genome, one data point. What happens when we get 10, 100? There are thousands of remains in museum collections around the world that have never been genetically tested. Some of them, like this man, might be preserved well enough to yield usable DNA. The next decade of ancient genomics could completely reshape our understanding of the ancient world. So, what do you think? Should we be opening more sealed jars? And what are you most surprised to learn about ancient Egyptian ancestry? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. We go deep on the science that rewrites history. Every video, no clickbait shortcuts. I'll see you in the next one.